If the repetitive nerve stimulation study is abnormal, do I need to perform jitter analysis for further confirmation?
Well, actually not. In the past, all patients were diagnosed without single fiber EMG because it was simply not available, and the diagnosis was valid. And I think that this still applies today. But what we gain with single fiber EMG is deeper insight. We see things that we cannot actually see so well with repetitive nerve stimulation. For example, take borderline values. When we are at 5% or 6%, then it is very good to have single fiber EMG because it will be then very convincing either on this or the other side. And when single fiber EMG is normal in a symptomatic muscle, then this is not myasthenia.
There is a situation in which we have found it of considerable value to have single fiber EMG measurements done early on, even when the repetitive stimulation was clearly and demonstrably abnormal. And that is when following the patient. To have had a baseline jitter study in a muscle that can be followed can be extremely useful in comparing with follow-up studies for confirmation of improvement or for detecting deterioration. But that's a very special circumstance, and I don't know that many clinics or laboratories use single fiber EMG in that way. We, however, have found it to be very valuable in quite a number of patients, and therefore that's our general policy. We try to do single fiber EMG in virtually every patient that we see with myasthenia.
For monitoring, I should like to add certainly what you said on that single fiber can be extremely useful, and you have shown that in very many papers. But for most laboratories it is easier, certainly, to follow the repetitive nerve stimulation finding. And if you do hand muscle and some proximal muscle, we see with improvement of myasthenia or with treatment that the first muscle to become normal is usually the hand muscles, and then you have nothing more to measure. And therefore it's good to start both in the distal and in the proximal muscle to continue the follow-up, because soon you are left with only the proximal muscle, the most sensitive of which is deltoid, but that is also a little tricky technically and a little painful, and the second one is anconeus and trapezius muscles.
At some point we have done a study, longitudinal study on patients with polymyositis, and it was shown that that sfemg can be really useful to look at the exacerbations, because it had even a predictive value. So when deterioration was expected, actually the jitter and blocking increased very much at an early stage.
Let me make a follow-up comment to the scenario that Erik just described when the repetitive stimulation studies are performed serially and they become normal in the hand first. Well, then ultimately, as the patient continues to improve, they'll also become normal in the proximal muscles. Mm-hmm. And that's the sort of situation in which we find the jitter to be particularly valuable. It's quite common as patients, in fact it's the rule, as patients achieve a satisfactory clinical response, for all of the repetitive stimulation studies to be normal. And yet the jitter studies remain abnormal to a certain extent. And if you follow patients long enough, you'll find that the jitter remains abnormal well after all of the clinical symptoms have disappeared. With further time, in some patients, the jitter will ultimately disappear. and it can be useful if such patients have symptoms that suggest that the myasthenia might be returning, to then be able to compare the jitter with what it was when they were at their best. And it can be either confirm that the myasthenia is returning, or it can provide confirmation that the symptoms that are returning are not likely to be due to returning of the myasthenia.